This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or just people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of Jewish history at Yeshiva University in the United States, and he is the author of numerous history books, the most recent of which is actually a counterfactual history, and it's entitled The Holocaust Averted, an alternate history of American Jewry, 1938 to 1967, which tries to imagine what the fate of American Jews would have been had the Jews of Europe not been exterminated. Professor Jeffrey S. Gurock is joining us now on the line from New York. Hello, Jeffrey, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much. I only wish I was in Tel Aviv to do this live, but this is the next best thing. So thank you very much for
Inshallah,
having me.
next time, upon the publication of your next book.
Very good.
So let's start with a general question. Let's imagine that the Holocaust had been averted. So, would American Jews have been better or worse off?
American Jews would have been worse off. You know, one of the dynamics of the Second World War as opposed to the Holocaust, and this may seem controversial at first glance, is that World War II for American Jews is a very, very good time. Ironically, it is a time where we're seen by our fellow Americans as very patriotic. Close to 1 million Jewish boys and some girls fight in the American Army. Prior to World War II, American Jews suffer through an era of ever-increasing social discrimination and anti-Semitism. But during World War II, we earn our bona fides in the mind of America. And after World War II, we, as American Jews, come out of that experience first very angry at what happened to our brethren in Europe, but as important, with a sense of belonging, a sense of empowerment, a sense of activism, which has a lot to do with how we managed our lives after World War II. So don't get me wrong, the Holocaust is a traumatic and horrible, horrendous experience for the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. Not denying that for a second. But as far as the American Jew is concerned, World War II, as opposed to the Holocaust, happens to be a very good time for us, and much of the life that Jews pursue positively after World War II in the United States is a function of how we perform and how we're seen by other Americans during this cataclysmic time in Jewish history.
Is it a two-way street, or do you ascribe more importance to one of these elements? Either the Jews were better received by the fellow compatriots, or was it really that the Jews came out of the shell, as it were, and became full-fledged Americans?
Well, I believe that for minority groups in America, the Jews specifically, your activism, your willingness to take on Jewish causes has a lot to do with how you see Americans looking at you. So my sense is that part one is that we do very well in the mind of America. In fact, there are all sorts of surveys that are done in the decade after World War II, an ever-increasing tolerance for Jews in America. When you feel that America has your back as a minority group member, that will give you an ability to be more powerful, to be more outspoken than you would have been if that was not the case. Mm-hmm. Now, clearly, the agenda is set by what happened to our brethren in Europe, but America calls the shots to some extent, and that has a lot to do with American Jews feeling free, feeling accepted. Look, the other dynamic is that after World War II in the United States, there's a great move to suburbanization. And whereas prior to World War II, Jews were kept out of many neighborhoods in other places, after World War II, suburbia, which becomes the hallmark of American civilization after the war, is wide open for American Jews. I should tell you that, by the way, this is not true of African Americans. African Americans are still restricted in terms of their mobility into suburbia, but American Jews are welcomed in.
Yeah.
And you should know that that causes problematics in terms of Jewish identity, but in terms of Jewish acceptance, it's a very, very important moment in time.
I feel that we're perhaps getting a bit ahead of ourselves, because one thing that I think should be spelled out is perhaps the difference between two terms that are parallel or perhaps have some sort of crossover between them, but they're still separate, and that is the Second World War and the Holocaust, because the Holocaust, was really by far the most horrendous component of the Second World War, but historically speaking, at least, it was just one out of many. And you address that in your book. You talk about different events and episodes in the war that were not directly related to the extermination of the Jews. So can you please briefly take us through the alternative sequence of events that you're presenting in it?
A turning point for all historians, and I always say in this book there's real history and then there's my historical fiction, but the real historical turning point in terms of the coming of the Second World War is the decision that the British and the French, but primarily the British, make to counter Hitler in Munich, basically giving away parts of Czechoslovakia and eventually all of Czechoslovakia. In my story, the British stand up to Adolf Hitler, and the war starts a year before it actually started in 1939. And in fact, we know from studies of the German military that at that point the Germans really weren't ready for war, and many of Hitler's generals were very concerned that Hitler would go off on this adventure and invade Czechoslovakia, and although they would win, they would have their noses bloodied by this encounter with a resolute Czech army. Well, in my book, that's exactly what happens. And as a result of that, Hitler is not ready to invade Eastern Europe in 1939. And remember, of the 6 million holy Jews who were killed, the vast majority live in Poland and in the Soviet Union. So those 6 million Jews will eventually, the Russian Jews and then the Polish Jews, because Stalin does take over Poland in my story, fall under communist domination. They are culturally deprived, but they are not exterminated. So the 6 million Jews are there in Eastern Europe. You know, of course, that most German Jews have six years to get out of Germany, and 2/3 of them are successful in migrating out. Unfortunately, many of them end up in France and the Low Countries, and of course they fall into the web of the Shoah after 1939. But be that as it may, the war starts a year early. The Nazis are shown not to be as militarily proficient as they'd be a year later, and the war bogs down on the Western Front like it did in World War I. And for 6 years, the war is going back and forth between France and Germany, and Hitler never succeeds in conquering France. He never marches under the Eiffel Tower, and in 1944, Hitler is assassinated by his generals. What I do in the book, by the way, is take many of the actual historical events, and I just twist them a little bit to tell my story. So there is a Second World War. America is not drawn into this war. There is a Pacific War which lasts till 1946, but there's no bombing of Pearl Harbor. And by the way, Gilad, you should know that in doing this research, I admit that I do not read Japanese, but I did access some translation of Japanese historiography, which indicates that the decision was almost made in the Japanese war councils not to bomb Pearl Harbor. And I have this image of December 7th, 1941, of American soldiers sunning themselves on the deck of the USS Arizona. So America is not drawn into this war that lasts 6 years. It is a second great war, but again, the Jewish component is a much smaller component than in the actual history. That's just a basic outline of some of the chronologies of this 6-year war that's going nowhere in Europe until Hitler was assassinated.
Yeah, you did say that you base, perhaps your narrative is loosely based on true events, and that is, I am assuming, because you're really a historian by trade. And my question to you on this is, how likely were the alternative events that you're describing to actually happen, or is the narrative in your book 100% fantastical?
Well, the smell test for any counterfactual history is its plausibility, and there are rules to this game. In fact, if you go back, for example, if you were to tell the story of the destruction of the Second Temple, you cannot give the Jews the Masada machine guns unless you give the Romans machine guns, right? So certain technological things you can't ascribe, it doesn't exist. I've been telling my audiences that I can't have Wendell Willkie run for president in 1944 against Roosevelt. He runs in 1940 because he dies before 1944, okay? So plausible. So all the historical evidence that I bring is based upon some plausible scenarios that appear in real historical works. So let me give you two examples. There's a wonderful book, very important book by a political scientist. His name was Karl Schloines, and it's called The Twisted Road to Auschwitz, in which he argues that between 1933 and 1939, although Hitler was committed to destruction of the Jews, it is a very twisted road. There are all sorts of alternative paths that were explored and were taken. And one of them is a well-known dynamic called the Transfer Agreement, the Havara Agreement between the Jewish Agency for Palestine and the Nazis, which made it possible for Jews to get out of Germany in the mid-30s, go to Palestine, and have some of the resources transferred to Palestine. So the leader of that dynamic in the Nazi hierarchy was a man named Halmashat, S-C-H-A-C-H-T. He was by no means a lover of Jews. He was an anti-Semite, but he wasn't a resolute Nazi. And in his dealings with Hitler in the 1930s, on the economic front, he often said to the Fuhrer, what should I do with Jews in this or that economic sphere? And Hitler tells him, when it comes to economics, do what you want as far as the German people are concerned. So in my story, taking that real historical figure and his activities for 5 or 6 years in the early years of the Third Reich, I have him now put in charge of the Jewish question. He is a pragmatist. He is someone who's not ideologically committed to the destruction of the Jews, and he becomes a very important figure. So all I have to do once the war bogs down is have Schott become a more important figure than he would be in real history. And the other piece is that the SS in its early days, although committed to killing the destruction of the Jews, is more concerned early on with, and this comes out of Schloines' book, political and other military opponents of the Reich. So in my book, that fear continues. And although the Jewish question is important, it is not the only problem which Hitler faces. So the 1933 dynamic continues to 1939.
But also going back to the Munich Agreement
Yes.
that you described earlier on, do you think, this is what I understand from what you just said, that within the year leading up to the 1st of September 1939, the balance of power for Hitler has changed dramatically because in your chronology, he barely survives the Czechoslovakia campaign that is relatively minor. And in real time, in real events, we know that as of 1939, Germany becomes an almost unparalleled European empire. One European country after the other just fall into the hands of the Nazis. So my question to you, do you really think that this year was really that momentous in these terms? And do you think that had Britain and the Soviet Union, France and other countries perhaps gone to war before or right after the Munich Agreement, things could have been dramatically different?
It's a good question, and it is correct to challenge the plausibility of that piece. So I'll say the following. I will admit to not being a military historian, although I read a significant amount of military history, particularly a piece by a military historian named Williamson Murray, who argued that the year 38 to 39 was a crucial year in terms of the development of Nazi armaments, and that what you describe as the overwhelming power of the German military, they had been untested, and that that year makes a big difference in terms of degrees of armaments, preparedness, and the like. And the other piece that should be mentioned is that all of Hitler's conquests in real history until the start of the Second World War were bloodless conquests. No German blood was spilled. The German people did not have to suffer at all in terms of his conquests. Well, the Czechoslovakian adventure that goes haywire raises all sorts of doubts, and there were doubts in the minds of the German military. In fact, Hitler and his generals often differ, although the generals often keep their dissent to themselves, about the power and preparedness of the Nazis. So yes, I think there is historical literature to suggest that 38 to 39 makes a great deal of difference.
I want to take you back to the American Jews, and of course in relation or as opposed to the European Jewry that would have survived the war that never took place. To what extent do the events that you describe in your book, the developments and the changes that the American Jewish community undergoes, are affected by the fact that they did not become the epicenter, together with Israel, of Jewish life in the world, and remained at the periphery thereof, with Europe, of course, being the very center?
Well, I guess I differ a little bit about whether American Jewry in real history was at the periphery. I would say that at that point, there are 2 and 3 centers, a growing Palestinian Israeli component, obviously the East European component, and the 4.5 to 5 million Jews in America. So there is a substantial Jewish community in America at that time, but the way I view them is, although they're substantial, they are a very skittish group and very concerned about their status. And it's only after World War II that there's a recognition on the part of American Jews that, you know what, now we have to take the leadership role that's been placed upon us, what took place in Europe. You know, one of the people who appears in this book a number of times was the first great American Jewish historian named Jacob Rader Marcus. I know you read the book, so you may recall Marcus at the Hebrew Union College. So he writes a book in 1934 called The Rise and Destiny of German Jewry, in which he predicts that German Jewry would survive Hitler. Of course, when the war begins, he realizes that he's all wrong, and he realizes that American Jewry has to assume this leadership role and begins developing at his school, the Hebrew Union College and elsewhere, a greater sense of historical consciousness for American Jews as we assume this role. So had the war not taken place, American Jews would have still been maybe a junior partner, but time would tell in terms of American Jews assuming leadership, even if the East European Jews was still there. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and of course Israel would perhaps not have existed or existed in a different way. So the whole relationship with Zionism and the State of Israel, I'm assuming, would have been different.
Well, that's one of the, I think, most important points about my book. When people ask me what it was, what do we get out of this? What do we come away with as far as the American Jewish and the world Jewish experience? So in my story, and we don't have hours to tell it, Israel comes into existence in a very, very different way. Okay, and one of the things clearly that the world community doesn't have to grapple with is the phenomenon of hundreds of thousands of displaced Jews and the phenomenon of all these Jews who were killed, the guilt that was raised as a result of the Shoah. So my story is very, very different. But I think one of the crucial events in my counterfactual history is the bombing of the King David Hotel. So in real history, as we all know, the King David Hotel is bombed by the Irgun after warning the British officers, and British officers and others are killed in that explosion. In my book, when the King David Hotel is destroyed, not only are British officers killed, but American peacekeepers are killed. Now, how these peacekeepers end up at the King David Hotel, your listeners have to read the book to find out, okay? Let's not give everything away.
Yeah.
But at this
no spoilers,
point,
please. Yeah.
At this point, Americans are very concerned about the fact that American peacekeepers had been killed in the Middle East. There's no guilt of the Shoah. There's a very tentative understanding of what Zionism represents. And in my story, Americans turn against the Zionists. I have Harry S. Truman, who is a little-known senator in my book from Missouri, saying, I can't back the Zionists. They've killed Americans. So then the question I raise in the book, what do American Jews do? And in my story, American Jews run for cover because they're afraid of dual allegiance, and there's a lot of that. A lot of that in my book.
Okay, Jeffrey, I just have to ask you one last question because I'm afraid
Sure.
we're running out of time.
Okay.
Perhaps a more methodological or personal question, because many historians, or at least those that I've spoken to, avoid counterfactual history like the plague. And I'd like to ask you, what motivated you to start this project? Did you reach a stage in your career that you said to yourself, I've written enough serious books, now I can do whatever I want?
Well, this is a serious book in its own right. I believe that through these, that there are critical turning points in history. Well, first, let me say there are people in the academy who do not approve of this type of work. That's for certain. Although I must tell you that the American Historical Review and the Association for Jewish Studies has had panels with people doing similar work to what I'm doing. But that apologia notwithstanding, I believe that as a historian, it's important to understand critical turning points in history. And one of the ways students and readers can get at these critical points is by looking at not only what actually transpired, but what could have transpired. And one of the things I do as a teaching device, that every chapter ends with a synopsis of what actually happened, what really happened, so we can compare these two things. So it isn't that I reached a stage of my career where I said, the heck with real history. This is real history, although twisted a bit, but I think it's a legitimate and, in fact, important teaching device.
All right. Well, this is all very fascinating. And of course, I urge all our listeners to get a hold of this book and read it because, first of all, it's very interesting, but also very unusual. Professor Jeffrey S. Gurock, Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University in New York and author of the recently published The Holocaust Averted, an alternate history of American Jewry 1938 to 1967. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye. That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I am Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
נועה נולדה בשדה בין דשא לאבן. נועה הייתה כמו עגל של טל, חרציתי כתבה בשדה ומן הכותרת טל שאלה לאל אל כן או לא, כן או לא, אלף שירים מבשיר נועה כן או לא, אלה עליי כן או לא אולי, כן או לא אולי, כן או לא אולי. נועה הובילה אותו בין דשא לאבן, נועה נשקה